perspective?
Nerve of bullfrogs. I knew that this was karma coming back to me, that this was a case of acute sciatica, and this was the late 70s, so the only medical imaging was still x-rays then. There was no CAT scan or MRI or anything. And I went to a neurologist, I went to an orthopedic surgeon, and both of them said the same thing to me. Lucky you, there's nothing wrong with your spine. And I gritted my teeth and I said, that's great, what do I do about this pain? And they said, well, just tell us what you'd like us to prescribe for you to knock down the pain, because if it doesn't show up on the x-ray, then it's a soft tissue problem. And I said, I don't want to knock down the pain, I want to know what the problem is. And they said, well, we can't help you. Nothing wrong with your spine, you need other kind of help. So I was in my Tai Chi class, it was arranged such that the master would assign an advanced student to each of the newcomers. And so this woman called me and she said, you stopped coming, you're doing fine, what happened? So I told her about my sciatica and the pain, and she said, okay, Mr. Western Scientist, it's time for acupuncture. So I thought, well, she's nailed me and I have to at least be open to it, and let's see, this is late 70s, let's see what it is. And she drove over and took me to her acupuncturist who had recently come over from Taiwan and was living with one of his students on a home overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Malibu. I walked in, this is quite wonderful, and I come in and I see out of the corner of my eye this elderly Chinese gentleman watching Sesame Street in the living room. And later, as I got to know him, and I kidded him about it, he said, no, this was really helpful to him learning English. Learning English. So anyway, then they brought me into the room that was set up as his clinic, and he gave me this one treatment, and after being in all this pain, nothing works for everybody for everything, but damned if that acupuncture didn't. I got back off the table and I was 80 to 90% pain-free, and that was also my first experience with Chinese herbs. In those days, there weren't granules or pills. You got the raw herbs and you had to brew them and turn your kitchen into this aromatic area of your home, and if you could even keep the smell just in your kitchen. But anyway, I had an amazing experience because I took the herbs to my lab where I was working as a biochemist. And in most biochemistry labs, there's something called a fume hood, which you, in case you're boiling or mixing chemicals that have bad smell, you pull down a very heavy glass front of the hood, and then the fumes are sucked out, hopefully not into the next lab, but out into the atmosphere. Anyway, so that's where I chose to brew my herbs, and I got a lot of flack from my colleagues who, when I started telling them about acupuncture, they said, you don't believe in acupuncture, do you? And I said, this is not a belief system, this is another system of healthcare, and we need to test it the way we test any system of healthcare. And by that time they were just rolling their eyes and walking out. But anyway, about the third day of taking the herbs, I felt, I've never had this experience since, but I had this rush of energy through my body, and the rest of the pain was gone. I had one more acupuncture treatment. And I thought, what is this, other way of looking at the body? Because, chiropractic, massage, they still use the Western body, basically. But here's a whole nother way of looking at the body, and I'm a Gemini, so I got interested right away in having one foot on either side of the biomedical paradigm, as it were. So as my sciatica healed, I not only went back to Tai Chi, but I started running to strengthen my leg, and I got running longer distances. And long story short, I found a wonderful massage therapist. And one day she said to me, I know these two Chinese brothers. This is now, we're about 1990. I know these two Chinese brothers who are starting an acupuncture college here in Santa Monica, and they need people like you to teach the Western clinical subjects because they need to learn that as well as the Chinese medicine. So I said, okay, sounds interesting. I'll meet with them. And we had lunch, and the first thing they wanted to know is, how does a Western scientist get interested in acupuncture? And I started telling them the story about this, 15 years earlier, and my treatment in Malibu and who the person was, and they started laughing. And I said, excuse me, this was a really painful experience. And and they said, no, we're not laughing at you, but we think that person who gave you the treatment was our father. So I think I'm on some path here. And sure enough, it turned out that was right. I mean, this was a multi-generational Chinese family, and the name of the acupuncture college in Santa Monica, Yosan University, was the grandfather. The Yosan Ni and I was the family name. Anyway, long story short, I looked at this is the first time I saw the how much Western medicine these students of Chinese medicine had to learn, and I said, this is great, but who's bringing the two sides together? Remember, I'm the Gemini here. And they said, what do you mean bring the two sides together? I said, well, maybe we really need to start thinking, to get acupuncture accepted, how it can be explained in part in terms of Western medicine. What are the correlates of an acupuncture point and a meridian and the healing? I since went away from that position, but at that point, that was where I was. Anyway, they encouraged me, and I put together an elective class, which we called Biomedical Understanding of Acupuncture. And that led to the class being very popular and becoming a required class. And the next thing I knew, one of the brothers took me for a hike up in the mountains near Will Rogers State Park. And he said, we'd really like you to come and be part of our college. So I had put in 25 years in biomedical research, and as you probably have heard, when you start doing research for that long, you get narrower and narrower in what you're doing. And I had a really good and productive time in biomedical research, and I thought, maybe acupuncture research is really what I'd like to do and start a new career. And so I agreed, and I took an administrative position at the acupuncture college with the hope of being able to start a research department, and that was not to be. They were just not in a financial position or a vision. They didn't have the right vision, and I gave up after almost 4 years and gave myself a 6-month sabbatical. And during that time, the woman who was then president of the acupuncture college in Portland, the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, had heard about me, and we had met once or twice, and knew my dream of starting an acupuncture college, and she was able to sell her board on the idea. And so she invited me up to Portland, and we had this wonderful walk in the Japanese garden. And then she said, what would it take to get you up here to start this? Well, my daughter and grandchild lived in Portland, so it was a kind of no-brainer for me to move up to Portland. And that was 99, and I remember signing my contract and looked down, and it was $9,999 when I started signing my contract. So I said to myself, well, not to anyone else, that I'm going to give this 10 years and I'm going to retire on 09/09/09. So that's what I did, and it was a wonderful 10 years because, as I was telling Teresa a bit on the way up, in 1999, the government, that part of the NIH that had originally started, Congress made them start this Office of Alternative Medicine, and in 1999, Congress upgraded it, much against the wishes of the NIH. Congress mandated that they upgrade to what's called a center. So they have an office, a center, and the institutes. The institutes are the largest entities at NIH. But now there was going to be a center, a national center for complementary and alternative medicine. And to get them kick-started, what they did was they took a large bunch of money to give to grants to medical centers and hospitals to do collaborative research between Western medicine and acupuncture, chiropractic, naturopathic medicine, or massage. And so, as my good luck would have it, that was 1999, and they gave out 5. They had a huge, got grants, applications from all over the country, and they gave out 5, and 2 of the 5 were in Portland.
Wow.
So that's when I hit Portland, and it was just quite wonderful, that timing for me. So one of the grants was to the neurology department at OHSU, and my area of biomedical research was the nervous system, so I was one of the few bilingual people, and so we were able to get involved with them. And interestingly enough, the more interesting research came out of Kaiser, their Center for Health Research, because they had on their staff 2 medical anthropologists, and I will always be grateful to them because they were the ones who really bridged the gap between Western medicine and these other types of medicine, these 2 medical anthropologists. And like the massage therapist said, oh my God, there's no way we can do research because we feel our way. We make up the procedure as we go to see what the patient needs. And they said, don't worry, these medical anthropologists said, this is what we do. Let us observe you and listen to how you watch how you treat. And within 6 months they had a protocol where if you do this, then you do this and this. So they were actually able to come up with a protocol. And we worked on what came to be called TMD, temporomandibular disorder, because Kaiser had some very good people in Western dentistry, so we did a kind of East-West approach to that. So anyway, that's how I got to Portland, how I got into acupuncture, and then maybe you guys can turn around,
me too.
because as I got more interested in as I got more interested in acupuncture, remember I started by saying, okay, we need to know what an acupuncture point is. Is it the same as nerves? And I wanted to get these correlates. But the thing that I found was fascinating me were parts of acupuncture in Chinese medicine that had no way to explain them in biomedical terms, in Western medicine terms. So there is something that Chinese medicine calls Y-I, but it's pronounced E, which they describe the closest to English word intention. So acupuncture is more than just putting this needle in the skin, but you actually are applying your intention, and that's as important a part of the treatment that you learn as where and how to place the needle. The second thing I learned about was a kind of acupuncture developed in Japan by blind acupuncturists called Toyohari. And that involves, when they were first being taught acupuncture, it's an honorable profession in Japan for the blind to be a physician, especially because there's a tradition where the women in the court in Japan, males were not allowed to look at their exposed flesh. So if you were blind and could learn medicine, then you could be accepted. So when they started learning acupuncture, there's a phrase in Japanese acupuncture called hooking the ki. Ki is the same as chi. Chi in Chinese and ki in Japanese. So hooking the ki means, those of you who have ever been fishing, when you're fishing and suddenly you get that pull on the line, that's what you try to look for when you're putting the needle in. So these blind people said, well, if that's what you want us to learn, we don't have to insert the needle to feel that. And they said, excuse me, this is called acupuncture. And they said, well, if you want us to learn what you're saying, then we don't have to put the needle in to feel that. Okay. So they developed this whole kind of, and showed that it was clinically effective, but all I had to do was put the needle above the point, and with their intention, they got amazing clinical results. So that was the second thing. And the third thing is, many of you probably have had some experience with Qigong exercises. So mostly Qigong is done by teaching you what to do. But there's a different kind of Qigong called medical Qigong or external Qigong, where the practitioner treats you. So you don't do it, but the practitioner does this. And this is done without physical touch. So the fascinating thing to me was each of these three aspects of Chinese medicine appears to engender or encourage healing with non-physical contact. So how to explain that? Some of you may be familiar with there were two books that really brought acupuncture to the West. One was Ted Kapchuk's book, The Web That Has No Weaver, and the other was by a husband and wife team, Harriet Beinfield and Ephraim Korngold, called Between Heaven and Earth, A Guide to Chinese Medicine. And they have these two wonderful drawings where, from a Western perspective, we see the body as a machine. The heart is a pump, the brain is a computer, and you can go in there and fix the parts much like a car and replace them. That's the whole biomedical model. And they use the metaphor of the body as garden more for the Chinese medicine model, that what you're doing is treating the soil to enrich, because you have to have healthy soil and you have to look at the whole landscape. You can't just look at one part of your garden. You have to see how they're all interwoven. And so that was great. And then I became aware of Alex Gray, as many of you are, I'm sure, where the body as energy. He's this wonderful visionary artist. So that's one whole stream in my life that I told you about, how I got to be here talking to the Vancouver IONS group of my adventures from biomedicine through acupuncture. But the other stream in my life, which I want to just briefly mention, began with hearing Alan Watts speak. I heard him speak once when I was in graduate school, and I was very much, as we were in those days, concerned with what is this. Who am I? What is this I inside me and everything? And Alan Watts that night was beginning to develop his book called Psychotherapy East and West. And he talked about, I remember it so vividly, he has this wonderful sonorous preaching voice. He was a preacher before he became a New Age guru. And he talked about the fallacy of the damage it does to us when we grow up with this idea of the function of the body is to carry me around. He called it the chauffeur theory of existence. And he said the I that's trapped inside the body and gets carried around, it leads to separateness and aloneness, and eventually to neuroses and psychoses was his message. And that resonated with me. And then so that was late 1960s. In the 1970s, many of you will remember, the human potential movement started. And there were workshops that we all went to, every few months. And Ken Pelletier had a workshop called Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer. That was his workshop, about how we have to get out from under the burden of figuring out how our mind is really controlling what we do. And in that workshop, they talked a lot about out-of-the-body experiences. Charles Tart he was at UC Davis at the time, and he had written this huge book on out-of-the-body experience. And what they were talking about at this workshop, I'm a kind of a control freak, so when I first learned about out-of-body experience, I was going to be the one person who couldn't get back, and I would be really sad. I couldn't get back in. But what they were talking about was really helpful, because they described it as, it's not an out-of-the-body. You're going from one part of your body to another part of your body. So instead of I being inside the body is inside of a larger I, a larger me. And that was a great step forward in my quest. And the third step, which I'll share with you, was in maybe the mid-90s, when I was down working at the City of Hope in my biomedical career. Stephen Hawking was going to come to Caltech to give a lecture. And it was December, and I got one of the worst flus, except for the most recent one. So these are my 2 times with the flu. That time, when I couldn't go to hear his lecture, I was really disappointed. But there was a wonderful woman, I'm blocking on her name. She was the science editor of the LA Times, and she went to his lecture, and she wrote it up the next day. And Stephen Hawking used this amazing sort of Zen koan to describe the universe. And he said the universe was finite but with no boundary. And I thought, okay, he's talking about the universe. That's my metaphor for who I am and who each of us are. We're finite, but where do we end? So how do we reconcile that? Somewhere in there was an important answer. And this woman, Beverly Rubik, was really one of my first gurus, in the sense of she was a Western scientist who was a biophysicist, and she really was on the right path. And in 2002, she wrote this very seminal paper on the Biofield hypothesis, biophysical basis and role in medicine. And 2 very important things came out of that paper. So she defined this term biofield as a collage of endogenously generated, so generated by the body, self-regulating fields. So they weren't little molecules, they were whole areas of field effects in the body. And at that time she felt they were largely electromagnetic. And they can be clinically diagnostic and modulated by healers or devices to affect health. And in that article, she introduced the term homeodynamic. Now, we all probably remember from high school biology the term homeostatic. Okay, so we don't like to think of the body, terms of homeostasis anymore, because that says there's this number is where this function should be, and that number. So if you get away from it, you have to get back to this number. That's homeostatic. Homeodynamic, the poster child for homodynamic, is heart rate variability. The more variability you have, the better able you are to cope with change and to respond. You're more resilient. So you want this variability. So what you want in all of these physiological parameters is homeodynamic, not homeostatic. So it's that to find what the range is. As you get ill, unfortunately also as we get older, our heart rate variability decreases. And so we can do exercises, both specific and non-specific, that will help to prevent that decline in heart rate variability. So let's get back to her definition, because clinically diagnostic. So what does that mean, biofields are clinically diagnostic? What it means is We all know about the electrocardiogram and the electroencephalogram. There's also electroretinogram, electromyogram. These are certainly the EEG helps clinically to assess the possibility of a tumor. For example, we can find very specific abnormalities in the EEG. Certainly there's all kinds of heart rate abnormalities that are detected by ECG. These are fields. The heart has the strongest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. The brain is second, and Chinese medicine says eventually we'll be able to detect the field, the electromagnetic field, around every organ in the body. We just don't have sensitive enough instruments yet. So the other thing in Beverly Rubik's definition is not only are biofields clinically diagnostic, but they can be modulated by healers or devices. So in 1992, there was a very important conference at the NIH, basically what to do about all this complementary and alternative medicine. How do we organize it? How do we put it in categories? How do we figure out what it was? And at that meeting, that was when the term biofield was first adopted, as well as the term biofield therapies. So all of these therapies which we're familiar with, Reiki, healing touch, therapeutic touch, external Qigong, Jiu-Rui, and many, many other sister modalities are called biofield therapies. And the most important thing for getting this term on the map was the Library of Congress accepted what are called mesh terms. So if you're searching the scientific literature, now biofield and biofield therapies are terms that you can search for. So that was a big step forward. So this biofield perspective does two important things. It gives us a common language between clinical practice and scientific research to understand the body in terms of fields. And the other thing is that the perspective gives us a unifying concept to bridge the traditional and the contemporary models that are seeking to define how we can look at the body in terms of energy medicine, basically. So what Beverly Rubik said, one of the things she said at the end of another article that she wrote more recently was the main difference she felt between the traditional views of the vital force, the chi and the prana and the ki in Japanese terms. Prana is, as you know, is the same term from Ayurvedic medicine. And the modern views, such as the biofield, is that the biofield rests on physical principles that can be measured, whereas the traditional concepts remain more metaphysical. I mean, people have spent a lot of time saying, what is the Western equivalent of qi? And, it started with qi is ATP, and it's... Anyway, I don't need to go into all of the papers that have been written about what qi is in Western terms. It's not we shouldn't even bother trying to reduce it. We should say we should live in one world or we should live in the other world. And these are two worlds that are simply not in the way we're presently equipped to think of it. We're not going to be able to marry the two. We're not going to be able to get specific correlates. So a colleague of mine down in San Diego decided to look at the research that had been published. Shamini Jain looked at the research that's been published on biofield therapies. So instead of saying, is this drug effective and compared to a placebo drug, people have started to do studies of Reiki and of healing touch, and half the people get the real thing and half the people get a mock or a pretend or a sham kind of treatment to compare them, and have published these. So at that time, 2009, when they were starting to do their work, they identified 66 clinical studies on a variety of biofield therapies, and they assessed them all in what's called a systematic review, where you apply a fixed set of criteria as to what you think are good trials that you're going to analyze. And they found that there was strong evidence for biofield therapies decreasing pain intensity in hospital outpatients, and moderate evidence for these other areas, pain intensity and anxiety in inpatients, pain in cancer patients, behavioral symptoms of dementia. So the really interesting question, if we want to put the biofield concept on the map, to me is all of these studies, almost all of those 66 studies that they looked at, they said, we want to know if biofield therapy, as practiced in clinical practice, is effective. And so almost all of these therapies, and most of you, I'm sure, have had experience with Reiki or healing touch or one of these, they're both hands-on and hands-off. There's some combination of sensing the energy flow and also putting your hands on specific areas to balance. So it's a combination of hands-on and hands-off. And the problem is, that's fine if the research question, remember I'm a researcher, if the research question is, are these biofield therapies effective as they're practiced in the real world? And that's a very valid question. But I'm this crazy guy who wants to know, how do we start to explain, and what's the evidence that you can get healing without physical touch? So anytime there's a study that's using physical as well as non-physical, we know that there's evidence that light touch, light massage can induce, can reduce anxiety. Light touch can reduce stress and pain, and we know how they do it. We know that they do it in part by releasing hormones. Some of you may have heard of this hormone called oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, for example, between a mother and the baby. And there are specialized sensory nerve endings that light touch will lead to clinical effectiveness. So that my question, when I came into this field, I said, are there clinical trials of biofield therapies that used only non-physical contact? Okay. So we published this review in 2014. And at that point, instead of the 66, it was almost 5 years later, we found 90 clinical trials of human biofield therapies. And when we looked carefully, because we had to read each the methods of how they did this, 28 of them out of the 90 compared non-physical contact to either a mimic non-physical contact or another active treatment. Okay, so 28 of the 90 used only non-physical contact in one of the groups. So of these 28 trials, 10 didn't meet our design or reporting standards. So you don't just take research just because it looks like it's doing the same thing. You really look at the methods. And for example, some of the studies tested Reiki and music therapy versus a control group. So you don't know if it was just the Reiki. Okay, so there were a number of reasons why we excluded. So we were left with 18 clinical trials that only used non-physical contact, and of these 18, 12 of them reported biofield therapy to produce statistically significant improvement in at least one of the outcomes. So we could conclude, although we need more of this kind of research, that non-physical contact biofield therapies can be can be beneficial. So we've got that idea behind us. Now comes the question of how do we begin to view our bodies from this biofield perspective. Okay, that's what really interests me. I'm a biochemist and physiologist, so I want to know, how do we do this? So the first thing is, people say auras, and auras is what I would put in the category of big B biofield. And I'm not ready to jump to that level yet. I'm not even sure when I will be, because that, again, I don't know if I'm dealing with different language that won't be able to be translated or not. But I'm putting that whole big B biofield aside, and I'm looking for little b biofields in the body for now. So many of you will have heard of James Oschman. His book, Energy Medicine in 2000, was the first book that really did this whole field a major service. He went over a wonderful historical perspective of many physicians who had tried in different ways to look at energy and got dumped on, reviled, lost their grants, were kicked out of the profession even. He reviews that, and he really brings together the evidence from current understanding of biology and medicine for this energy medicine perspective. And a very simple approach, he says, okay, we know that a hormone or an immune system, any kind of antigen, any kind of stimulus molecule, interacts with a receptor on the surface of the cell. Okay, so is there any evidence that an electromagnetic field can respond to certain receptors? So the next step that he took was that some hormones respond by interacting with receptors on the surface of the cell. Those are peptide hormones, ACTH, and stress hormone, that's an example. Steroid hormones are very different animals. They are fat soluble, so they can go right through the membrane, and they interact with receptors right on our DNA. So you have water soluble hormones, which are the peptides, and fat soluble hormones, which are the steroids, and the second class can get right into the DNA. So there's a lot of very good evidence for what on the DNA are called hormone response elements. So the way the hormone works is it acts on a receptor that's what we call upstream from where the actual gene is. So when the hormone hits that receptor on the DNA, it activates the gene, basically. So what Martin Blank at Columbia University in the late 2000s started doing some research where they were working with cells in tissue culture and zapping them with different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation, basically. And they found that at certain frequencies, to their surprise, certain genes got what we call turned on, upregulated. Okay, so he thought maybe in the same way that there's a hormone response element, that there's an electromagnetic response element. And by making that analogy with the wonders of molecular biology, you can actually go into the DNA and snip off from those genes that were being turned on by the electromagnetic frequencies. You can snip off a region upstream from that gene, and then, amazingly, you can anneal it. You can literally glue that region onto a different area of the DNA upstream from a gene that wasn't activated. And now, when you put the electromagnetic frequency onto the cells, those new genes get activated. So it looks very much like there may be, right at the level of our DNA, the ability to respond to specific frequencies which may be generated by the body of electromagnetic radiation. Okay. I won't go into any more that level of stuff. The other thing I just want to tell you about is
diving.
is very early on, people weren't believed who detected low levels of light being given off as byproducts of molecular reactions in the body. Specifically, mitochondria, which are responsible for energy generation, give off light particles. And those light particles are called biophotons. Okay. And there's now increasing evidence that by detecting this biophoton, you can get a sense of level of health. And this is a really hot, fascinating area of research to show, especially people can do it in tissue culture, when two populations of cells are physically kept apart because they're in different dishes, and they can detect communication so that one population of cells can affect another population, and then they can put different barriers between them that will prevent visible light but not UV light, or the opposite. UV light can cross but not visible light, and they can detect that there's actual biophoton as communication between different populations of cells.
What's that on?
Anyway, stay tuned. It's fascinating. So, the first way to introduce the biofield perspective into the model is to consider biofields as parallel systems to molecular. So you have molecular systems and you have biofield systems. But I like to take the big jump. I think it's really important in science to come up with hypotheses, but what's really critical is you have to be able to tell people where the facts stop and where the hypothesis. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice both to the scientific community, who's not going to start believing, and more important, to the non-scientific community. So there is no evidence yet, but there's more and more interesting talk about considering all systems as biofields, from the organism to the tissue, to the cell, even to the molecule. So this is what I like. There's this old apocryphal story about the Indian brave coming to the chief and saying, what is the story with our origin myth about the world being held up by a tortoise? And the chief says, well, what's the problem with that? He says, well, what's holding up the tortoise? And so the chief says, another tortoise. And he says, what's holding up that? And so the answer eventually is turtles all the way down. So I want us to at least consider the idea of biofields all the way down. And here's the way I want to do this, it struck me, is many of us are familiar with this famous painting. Okay, this is not a pipe, right? Why is it not a pipe? Because it's a painting of a pipe, and it's a photograph of the painting of the pipe, and it's a slide of the photograph of a painting. So this is not a pipe, okay? Here's the deal. This is not a molecule. We have to stop drawing in all our medical textbooks and all our high school books these sticks and balls. I mean, nothing could be worse or further from the truth than a molecule as being this rigid structure. Molecule is constantly vibrating. It's constantly in motion. So, ceci n'est pas une molécule, or excuse my French. So I don't know, I can't find a drawing of this, but basically this is a review article that says, look, molecules encounter each other, molecules find their receptors, not in a random way. If you ask biochemists now, they'll still say, oh, it's just random association. There's so many molecules that are going to bump into the receptor, or Brownian motion makes them move, and eventually they're going to hit that receptor in just the right way. They say no. chemical codes are unsatisfactory, since no reason is given why a molecule is able to encounter its molecular partner just in the right place at the right time. This would demand a long-range recognition and attraction among molecules. What they're suggesting is that a molecule in its vibration pattern gives off a specific frequency and helps it to home in on its receptor. So it's a whole new way of looking at life as chemistry. It's really life as energy at every level of how cells find each other, how molecules find each other. It's just a fascinating new approach. So what are all the implications here? Obviously, the more we understand about the fields in the body is going to be an increased awareness of both positive and negative effects of the electromagnetic smog that we're increasingly living in. I think that biofield variability may be a really important, once we learn how to measure these biofields, they are obviously going to have a variability, and they're going to be a clinical measure, preclinical measure of healthcare similar to heart rate variability. And obviously, the more we understand the biofield perspective, the more it's going to affect our sense of interpersonal contact and societal health. Really important. That's what I hope we can talk about. So my mantra is, put your hand on your other arm and say, I don't end here. I mean, that is really the mantra. Now we're right back to Stephen Hawking's of, I'm finite but no boundary. Okay? And that's how we have to start thinking about ourselves. So I know I said I wasn't going to tell you any more research, but at the Heart Math Institute, which many of you know in Central California, they have the first data. Roland McCready is their really brilliant research director, so that a specific aspect, it's called the R wave, of one subject's electrocardiogram begins to synchronize with part of the EEG of another subject. So once you focus on each other, you become, the term is entrained. So one person's fields begins to entrain somebody else's field. I'll briefly tell you, the other thing Heart Math Institute is not published yet, but what they're doing is really exciting. I said before that the heart has the strongest electromagnetic field in the body. That's the basis of the ECG. Well, guess what? You don't have to have the electrode on the surface of the body to detect the ECG. You can detect it out to 3 feet now. And you can get all the same information. It's not being used clinically yet because this is a hard thing to get people to understand. But they're doing the research that's beginning to show that. Okay. The second thing is a friend and colleague of mine in Tucson, University of Arizona, is doing a lot of work on with horses in equine therapy, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And she's come up with the amazing thing that if she can train people's heart rate variability to become what's called coherent with their nervous system, the more coherent that those physiological variables are, the more likely the horse is going to come over to you. The horse can sense these fields in us. The less heart rate variability, the less variability we have, the more ill we are, the horse is going to have a harder time coming over to us. When she has a way of training, she's doing this with healthy people first, training them to increase their coherence, and then she's finding time and again increasing that bonding. At Chi, which I'll tell you about in just a second, this is a small organization I've been helping to get started. she stands for the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We were approached by a woman, Eileen McCusick, who's based in Vermont, who has decades of experience of healing with tuning forks. And what she finds is that she's a New Englander, so she activates the tuning fork on a hockey puck. She goes boom, and you hear the sound. And then she identifies the chakra points, and she starts what's called combing the field. Simply moving the tuning fork and listening to the sound. And there are certain points along that chakra line where there's a perturbation, an alteration of the sound. And what she knows is, with her tuning fork, she can determine where the edge of the field is. And the edge of the field, different people with different devices are differently sensitive. So the edge of the field, the human field, is detected at different. With the tuning fork, they detect the edge of the field as somewhere between 5 and 6 feet. Okay, so if you're 60 years old, and that's out there at 6 feet, if 1/3 of the way out is where you have a perturbation, what she knows is that something happened to you at age 20, 1/3 of the way. Okay, and it's either a physical or an emotional trauma that is stored like tree rings, except external to the body. So she came to us wanting help in developing a device so she wouldn't have to keep banging on the tuning fork. A device where you could set the particular frequency, you could press a button and it would activate it, and you would get the sound, and it could also have a recorder built in, so you would know where those perturbations were. So I said to her, this is going to take not only quite a while, but it's going to be quite expensive, and really all you have is your clinical experience. And investors are going to want to know, they want to have some level of clinical research. And she said, well, what would you do? And I said, the first thing I would do is you come to where our testing lab is and bring you and 2 other practitioners who you've trained, who you have confidence in, and we'll just try this first as a pilot study. We'll bring 4 subjects on the table, and each of you is going to do each of these subjects, and we want to see how well you agree. Okay, this is called inter-rater agreement or inter-rater reliability. And this is commonly done in any kind of physical medicine to see if you can reproduce it. So we've already done the pilot study on this, and curiously enough, we got too much data, too many numbers, too many perturbations. They do 8 sites on each side, so we're having to scale way back to be able to look at this massive data and to see if we've now scheduled the next study to do this, and we're waiting for permission to do any kind of work with human subjects. You have to get what's called IRB permission. That's an institutional review, and it's human subjects. These groups will look at your research and give you approval, making sure that it's worth the subject's while, making sure that there isn't more risk than benefit. So that's the stage we are. Needless to say, getting reproducible evidence that there is memory, that there is stored information outside of the body on past trauma would be paradigm busting, as we say, needless to say, in terms of the biomedical model. So I have to put in a plug for the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, and the first thing we did, we had this we've been working very closely with IONS as the Consciousness and Healing. This is Garrett Yount, who's one of their main researchers, and tucked in behind here is Marilyn Schlitz, who used to be the research director at IONS. This is Roland McCready, who I mentioned, is the research director. So what the Consciousness and Healing Initiative is a small organization, and we don't want to compete with IONS or with HeartMath. What we call ourselves is a collaborative accelerator. So when we have an area that we're interested in, we bring the few people from all of these, from academia as well as these other organizations together. So the first thing we did was to have a 30-person meeting on the biofield. And we brought in people who were scholars of Hinduism and Buddhism. We brought in people who were experts on all the devices that are on the market for detecting fields, both detection and treatment. We brought in some forefront physicists who amazed us in terms of how much language we had to learn from them, in terms of how to explain what's going on. And what we did was we put together, and I brought a copy for everyone, we wound up with a dozen white papers. A white paper is like where you review all the evidence in a field, and it's both practical and theoretical. And we got a journal called Global Advances in Health and Medicine to publish all of these papers in all the different areas of the biofield in one issue, so that would be all together. So that anyone who joins CHI for a nominal amount gets access to all of these papers electronically, free. So that's about it. In summary, the Biofield Perspective, Biofield Physiology is an alternative, or maybe we could say a complementary perspective to life as chemistry. At present, we're not ready to talk about the biofield, but many little biofields, and we just have to see where that leads us. And keep reminding yourself, I don't end here. So we have this concept of the biofield. We all went through hi-fi and Wi-Fi. Now we've got the Wi-Fi. So I'll leave you with the Wi-Fi. I would love there to be a field called biofield sociology, where we really start to think of how our lives would be changed, how we would live our lives differently if we really understood that when somebody says, get out of my space, they really are in your space, for good and for bad. and what does that really mean, that I don't end here, and there is a physical manifestation of ourselves that's getting to be more and more detectable.
So could we have, maybe you want to get back in your chairs, some of you that were up here? Would you be more comfortable in your chairs? And then you can answer some questions.
I'm so sorry to go.
That's okay. That's all right. I have a question. If you don't mind.
We had first one.
Mine.
Sure.
Do you have a mic? There we go. Okay.
I like to take the big jump. I think it's really important in science to come up with hypotheses, but what's really critical is you have to be able to tell people where the facts stop and where the hypothesis. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice both to the scientific community, who's not going to start believing, and more important, to the non-scientific community. So there is no evidence yet, but there's more and more interesting talk about considering all systems as biofields, from the organism to the tissue to the cell, even to the molecule. So this is what I like. There's this old apocryphal story about the Indian brave coming to the chief and saying, what is the story with our origin myth about the world being held up by a tortoise? And the chief says, well, what's the problem with that? He says, well, what's holding up the tortoise? And so the chief says, another tortoise. And he says, what's holding up that? And so the answer eventually is turtles all the way down. So I want us to at least consider the idea of biofields all the way down. And here's the way I want to do this, it struck me, is many of us are familiar with this famous painting. Okay, this is not a pipe, right? Why is it not a pipe? Because it's a painting of a pipe, and it's a photograph of the painting of the pipe, and it's a slide of the photograph of a painting. So this is not a pipe, okay? Here's the deal. This is not a molecule. We have to stop drawing in all our medical textbooks and all our high school books these sticks and balls. I mean, nothing could be worse or further from the truth than a molecule as being this rigid structure. Molecule is constantly vibrating. It's constantly in motion. So, ceci n'est pas une molécule, or excuse my French. So I don't know how, I can't find a drawing of this, but basically this is a review article that says, look, molecules encounter each other, molecules find their receptors, not in a random way. If you ask biochemists now, they'll still say, oh, it's just random association. There's so many molecules that are going to bump into the receptor, or Brownian motion makes them move, and eventually they're going to hit that receptor in just the right way. They say no. Chemical codes are unsatisfactory since no reason is given why a molecule is able to encounter its molecular partner just in the right place at the right time. This would demand a long-range recognition and attraction among molecules. What they're suggesting is that a molecule, in its vibration pattern, gives off a specific frequency and helps it to home in on its receptor. So it's a whole new way of looking at life as chemistry. It's really life as energy at every level of how cells find each other, how molecules find each other. It's just a fascinating new approach. So what are all the implications here? Obviously, the more we understand about the fields in the body is going to be an increased awareness of both positive and negative effects of the electromagnetic smog that we're increasingly living in. I think that biofield variability may be a really important, once we learn how to measure these biofields, they are obviously going to have a variability, and they're going to be a clinical measure, preclinical measure of healthcare, similar to heart rate variability. And obviously, the more we understand the biofield perspective, the more it's going to affect our sense of interpersonal contact and societal health. Really important. That's what I hope we can talk about. So my mantra is, put your hand on your other arm and say, I don't end here. I mean, that is really the mantra. Now we're right back to Stephen Hawking's of, I'm finite but no boundary, okay? And that's how we have to start thinking about ourselves. So here's, I know I said I wasn't going to tell you any more research, but at the Heart Math Institute, which many of you know in Central California, they have the first data. Roland McCready is their really brilliant research director, so that a specific aspect, it's called the R wave, of one subject's electrocardiogram begins to synchronize with part of the EEG of another subject. So once you focus on each other, you become, the term is entrained. So one person's fields begins to entrain somebody else's field. I'll briefly tell you. The other thing, Heart Math Institute is not published yet, but what they're doing is really exciting. I said before that the heart has the strongest electromagnetic field in the body. That's the basis of the ECG. Well, guess what? You don't have to have the electrode on the surface of the body to detect the ECG. You can detect it out to 3 feet now. And you can get all the same information. It's not being used clinically yet because this is a hard thing to get people to understand. But they're doing the research that's beginning to show that. Okay. The second thing is a friend and colleague of mine in Tucson, the University of Arizona, is doing a lot of work on with horses in equine therapy, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And she's come up with the amazing thing that if she can train people's heart rate variability to become what's called coherent with their nervous system, the more coherent that those physiological variables are, the more likely the horse is going to come over to you. The horse can sense these fields in us. The less heart rate variability, the less variability we have, the more ill we are, the horse is going to have a harder time coming over to us. When she has a way of training, she's doing this with healthy people first, training them to increase their coherence, and then she's finding time and again increasing that bonding. At Chi, which I'll tell you about in just a second, this is a small organization I've been helping to get started. Chi stands for the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We were approached by a woman, Eileen McCusick, who's based in Vermont, who has decades of experience of healing with tuning forks. And what she finds is that she's a New Englander, so she activates the tuning fork on a hockey puck. She goes boom, and you hear the sound. And then she identifies the chakra points, and she starts what's called combing the field. Simply moving the tuning fork and listening to the sound. And there are certain points along that chakra line where there's a perturbation, an alteration of the sound. And what she knows is, with her tuning fork, she can determine where the edge of the field is. And the edge of the field, different people with different devices are differently sensitive. So the edge of the field, the human field, is detected at different. With the tuning fork, they detect the edge of the field as somewhere between 5 and 6 feet. Okay, so if you're 60 years old, and that's out there at 6 feet, if 1/3 of the way out is where you have a perturbation, what she knows is that something happened to you at age 20, 1/3 of the way. Okay, and it's either a physical or an emotional trauma that is stored like tree rings, except external to the body. So she came to us wanting help in developing a device so she wouldn't have to keep banging on the tuning fork. A device where you could set the particular frequency, you could press a button and it would activate it, and you would get the sound, and it could also have a recorder built in, so you would know where those perturbations were. So I said to her, this is going to take not only quite a while, but it's going to be quite expensive, and really all you have is your clinical experience. And investors are going to want to know, they want to have some level of clinical research. And she said, well, what would you do? And I said, the first thing I would do is you come to where our testing lab is and bring you and 2 other practitioners who you've trained, who you have confidence in, And we'll we'll just try this first as a pilot study. We'll bring 4 subjects on the table, and each of you is going to do each of these subjects, and we want to see how well you agree. Okay, this is called inter-rater agreement or inter-rater reliability. And this is commonly done in any kind of physical medicine to see if you can reproduce it. So we've already done the pilot study on this, and curiously enough, we got too much data, too many numbers, too many perturbations. They do 8 sites on each side, so we're having to scale way back to be able to look at this massive data and to see if we've now scheduled the next study to do this, and we're waiting for permission to do any kind of work with human subjects. You have to get what's called IRB permission. That's an institutional review, and it's human subjects. These groups will look at your research and give you approval, making sure that it's worth the subjects while, making sure that there isn't more risk than benefit. So that's the stage we are. Needless to say, getting reproducible evidence that there is memory, that there is stored information outside of the body on past trauma would be paradigm busting, as we say, needless to say, in terms of the biomedical model. So I have to put in a plug for the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. And the first thing we did, we had this, we've been working very closely with IONS as the Consciousness and Healing. This is Garrett Yount, who's one of their main researchers, and tucked in behind here is Marilyn Schlitz, who used to be the research director at IONS. This is Roland McCready, who I mentioned, is the research director. So what the Consciousness and Healing Initiative is a small organization, and we don't want to compete with IONS or with HeartMath. What we call ourselves is a collaborative accelerator. So when we have an area that we're interested in, we bring the few people from all of these, from academia as well as these other organizations together. So the first thing we did was to have a 30-person meeting on the biofield. And we brought in people who were scholars of Hinduism and Buddhism. We brought in people who were experts on all the devices that are on the market for detecting fields, both detection and treatment. We brought in some forefront physicists who amazed us in terms of how much language we had to learn from them, in terms of how to explain what's going on. And what we did was we put together, and I brought a copy for everyone, we wound up with a dozen white papers. A white paper is like where you review all the evidence in a field, and it's both practical and theoretical. And we got a journal called Global Advances in Health and Medicine to publish all of these papers in all the different areas of the biofield in one issue, so they would be all together. So that anyone who joins Chi for a nominal amount gets access to all of these papers electronically, free. So that's about it. In summary, the Biofield Perspective, Biofield Physiology is an alternative, or maybe we could say a complementary perspective to life as chemistry. At present, we're not ready to talk about the biofield, but many little biofields, and we just have to see where that leads us. And keep reminding yourself, I don't end here. So we have this concept of the biofield. We all went through hi-fi and Wi-Fi. Now we've got the Wi-Fi. So I'll leave you with the Wi-Fi. I mean, I would love there to be a field called biofield sociology. where we really start to think of how our lives would be changed, how we would live our lives differently if we really understood that when somebody says, "Get out of my space," they really are in your space, for good and for bad. and what does that really mean, that I don't end here and there is a physical manifestation of ourselves that's getting to be more and more detectable.
So could we have, maybe you want to get back in your chairs, some of you that were up here? Would you be more comfortable in your chairs? And then you can answer some questions.
I'm so sorry to go.
That's okay. That's all right. I have a question. If you don't mind.
We have first one.
Mine.
Sure.
Do you have a mic? There we go. Okay, here, she's moved if you want to sit where you can see. Okay. No problem. Yeah.
What?
Well, we had the lady with the pink visor was first hand up.
Okay. By disguise.
Yeah.
You want me to stand up?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you said stand up. Okay, this is huge. I'm not a scientist. I'm more of an intuitive, or investigative, but intuitive more. And I've had a lot of training in energy work. Okay. So while you're explaining all this, what's going through my mind is, why do we have to make it so difficult? Because one thing I thought about when you were talking about the tuning fork and the different, what if I just take my pendulum, which I was trained in certain ways to use, and which I trained in certain ways to give me answers to certain things. What if I just take that and I ask when this happened? And in my experience, it could be any way from hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, or in past lifetimes. And it's not a belief system, like you said. It's not a belief system. It just is. And it may work or it may not. But anyway, so I can go, way back, or I can come into the present here on this planet, this lifetime kind of thing. And by asking, using what would be called, the person that I'm working with, their higher self, or their could be, it could be called different. There are lots of different names for different things, but it's all kind of the same thing. And working with that person at that level, intentionally at that level, not here, in my own little mind, but expanded. What if I just do that and it works, and I don't have to do all of this to find it out? And one of the things what I kept thinking of, and I think about this all the time, is that they kept telling me, different ones, kept telling me that we who are working with the energy fields and in different ways are doing this, but it isn't really acceptable. It's woo-woo stuff, because the scientists have not proven it yet. So little by little, as the science come up with this proof that you're doing, then it becomes more and more acceptable. So there's a place for this. But on the other hand, there's this other part too. And you talked about the two different things. Well, I'm way up there. And in terms of, what I've done or understand or whatever. So what if I just use my pendulum then? I guess I wouldn't have as many clients, maybe. And I wouldn't be as accepted in mainstream society.
Do you think?
Is there a question?
What's the question?
I think I just would very quickly say that before this whole craze, and it's just so overblown about evidence-based everything, evidence-based medicine, there was something called experience-based medicine, and that's where all of these things got started. So, if you are helping people and getting consistent findings, then forget about, then why do you want, at that level of what you're doing, it's never going to be accepted by mainstream. It's just not. Okay, so you make that choice of how you want to live your life and how you want to help people, and that's fine. But I'm this crazy researcher, and so just for starters, I would love to compare the tuning fork to the pendulum and see do you
really
get
fun,
similar
yes.
results, and that's a kind of different kind of validation. And even everybody who is so enamored with evidence-based medicine, there is a lot of kinds of evidence besides clinical trials. And clinical experience is evidence. Mm-hmm. So, that's just how I would argue, and that's not going to get me anywhere with the FDA. It's not going to get me anywhere with NIH. But I've come to accept that the important thing is healing, and if you can do healing, more power to you.
The question part
Let's let somebody else.
Okay, well, I just wondered if that could be combined. Would it be acceptable?
So other people get a chance to
look at it.
A middle ground. Edgar Mitchell, in starting out the Institute of Neuroscience, talked about experiential research, where we are all citizen experimenters, and we can do this kind of thing and share what happens, and it can plug into either model.
Yeah. Paul, did you have your hand up
I was
before?
just curious where the funding comes from.
I could tell you where the funding was coming from.
That's kind of that was going to lead, because I wondered if the present administration, if that's drying up.
Well, even the funding for straight-ahead biomedical research is drying up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right across the line now.
So it's primarily public.
The Congress no longer has its Tom Harkin from Iowa was the main proponent that got Congress to force NIH to look at these other types of healing, and there's no champion
For that.
anymore. And I was fortunate to hit the beach right at the right time.
So in this arena, we're kind of moving into a quasi-dark age.
Well,
it's not with public money.
It's not with public money, but it's quite amazing, even with straight-ahead biomedical research, how much public funding. And what's the generic term for it on the internet when you crowdfunding? Yes, and I think we need to encourage IONS, encourage HeartMath. I mean, they are barely keeping their research going, and they have to do all kinds of other things to keep their research afloat. But IONS has just terrific people doing. Julia Mossbridge and Garrett Yount and Marilyn Schlitz, when she was still there, just doing really exciting, pushing the boundary, pushing the edges.
Thank you.
Okay, so who was one of you was next? Go ahead, Milton, and then we'll work our way around.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it couldn't take a minute to tie together what you finished with what you started with. That is, how does all this tie together with the acupuncture? And what I'm thinking is several of us heard Rupert Sheldrake talk about the morphic field, which is very similar, parallel to this, I think. And he was speaking in India, and an Indian gentleman said, "I know this. My people have known it for 1,000 years." And I'm just wondering, I mean, do the acupuncturists, the two brothers, the father, do they know this?
The Dalai Lama loves to dialogue with neuroscientists and cognitive science researchers, and he says, Buddhism has known these kinds of things for centuries, thousands of years. But he also says that if science can disprove anything in Buddhism, then he's all for that also. So, there are, acupuncture isn't acupuncture. There's all different kinds of acupuncture, and most of what passes for acupuncture now in the States certainly was put together by the Maoists. And it's a very westernized form of acupuncture. And there's other kinds of acupuncture that have shamanic roots, very, very strong shamanic roots. They talk about the ancient sages living, I won't say monastic lives, but lives in such isolation that when they swallow an herb that they could sense what meridian and what channel it was going through, and that's how they developed a lot of the herbalism. And so it's just like we need to still learn from the diminishing number of indigenous peoples who have such a knowledge of live in harmony with the plants around them. We need to find the scholars who are still left who know the ancient roots of these medicines, so we don't lose that pre-Maoist understanding.
Go ahead and then.
Me?
Yeah, and then.
My question is, we mentioned Buddhism and we mentioned, therapy and psychologists and so forth. So that brings up the question of, are the thoughts, for example, of the one that you're researching, the mental content, is the mental content also being observed or taken into account, either to improve the healing or the shift, or the opposite?
Yeah, when I would teach a research class, which I did for many years at OCOM, at the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, I would end my last class was giving students research questions, and they had to design the research. And I would always sneak in one where to design research to test that intention part, that that E part, and we never could. No one ever came up. I would love to have an award for who can show that that's really that is an essential part of healing. Exactly. It's like the best practitioners in any kind of medicine have a strong sense of intuition for the diagnosis and a strong sense of that intention for treatment. And those two things have to really be developed in any kind of, whether it's chiropractic or acupuncture or straight ahead Western medicine. That's so important to train.
They do double-blind studies because of that.
Well, but you don't know what to blind. You don't know. I always say that the problem with those double-blind studies with acupuncture, and everybody talks about sham acupuncture. We'll put the needle in some place where there isn't an acupuncture point, or they have these little stage daggers as the sham acupuncture, so that you press down, but the point is blunted, so the tip retracts into the shaft. It's like in the operas. But the problem is, all that does is fools the patient into what they see. But you can't have sham acupuncture if you don't know how the real acupuncture works. You can't have a sham if you don't know what's going on. So they're all a sham. Sham acupuncture really.
I agree with that, but I just say Western medicine does double-blind studies because intention is real.
Western medicine does the only real double-blind studies that Western medicine pretends to do are the drug studies. Okay, because you know how the drug is absorbed, and what its receptor is. You know how it's metabolized. So you give a pill that doesn't do any of these things. So you can at least approach that. But now that we know that placebo is real, that placebo has a strong physiological base, all of that is put into question also. So
This brings up hundreds of questions for me, but I'll keep it simple. When you talked about measuring heart rate variability, what machine does that?
oh, it's really a simple thing. It's non-invasive, and it's called a Holter monitor. And it measures just heart rate, and then it's a computer device that turns the rate into the variability. It's called a fast Fourier transform in statistical terms. But it shows you over time how the rate varies. But it's a very simple thing to
variation
do.
is good, no variation is
Up to a point. I mean, up to a point. But yes, there's quite a range where you can improve your variability to the betterment of your health.
And then you find a horse in your front yard.
Then you know it's working. At least it better not be on your pillow.
Yeah, really. Right. You want to know what's going on? Ask the horse.
That's right. Ask the
Sheila,
horse.
you had your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question. I know you have some background or knowledge of shamanic healing. I know you from OCOM because I teach there.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you've ever done any research with shamanic healings because
No, the first real, acceptable clinical trial of shamanic healing was done at Kaiser during that grant. They were actually treating women with TMD, with shamanic healing, and fake shamanic healing.
what is TMD?
Oh, sorry. It used to be temporomandibular. When you jaw pops and you at night.
Right.
Yeah.
Grinding.
So there's very few real studies of shamanic healing in the literature, because it's such a complex. The further you get away from doing one drug or one acupuncture point, or one chiropractic manipulation, when you're doing a whole, it's really hard. I mean, I was lucky enough to get funded with a group from Kaiser to do the first and only study NIH has funded, which is called whole systems research. We said we're not going to study acupuncture, we're going to study Chinese medicine. We're not going to study just jaw massage. We're going to study the whole complex of what specialty dental care is for TMD. So that was fascinating, but it's so hard. They wanted us to design a sham whole systems research. So they wanted us to do sham tuina, which is Chinese massage, sham herbs, sham acupuncture. It's just crazy. So we finally talked them out of that, and we think they gave us the grant just because they thought we couldn't do it.
One of those kind of studies.
And in shamanic healing, the intention is also the most important part. The intention of the healer.
Yeah.
And clarity and the grounded.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about it
in
afterwards.
every indigenous culture, which is really difficult to measure, as I mentioned, in research.
Mark?
I did a couple things. I have the M-Wave machine that's the heart rate variability if anybody wanted to borrow it. I
A
loan
what?
it to people.
M-Wave.
It's the M-Wave is the heart mouth.
M-Wave.
So I got a couple things I'll wrap into a question real quick. You're familiar with Tiller's research in terms of the intention, robust shift in pH
By 1 unit, yeah, I know.
controlled study. Well, the interesting thing about that is human intention over time. What he came to understand is that it got easier to do in the space he was doing in it as the research facilities changed from one place to the other, and they measured that effect and was able to measure a shift in the space in the field. The gauge symmetry of the field that they were practicing and changed and made the outcomes different. And you kind of started to get to the place where you're saying, well, we're not ready to go there yet, that there's this field thing that's bigger than this field or this field or that field. But at some point, are you moving towards or imagining, thinking of it all as a field with interactions of aspects of that field entangled and interacting in an information network that's beyond this cell or that cell, and the physiology we still have a tendency, because of our Western conditioning, to look at as biology. But what's the atomic level? What's the subatomic level? And how is it in the Earth's living field rotating with the rest of this stuff? Is it all a field?
Well, Tiller would say yes, of course. Tiller has his mathematics to really back up his big B biofield. But Tiller's work is unusual because, for frustrating reasons, and frustrating means we don't know why, many of these kinds of research have just the opposite problem. That the first person does it and they get all excited and they do it and they can't repeat it. Mm-hmm. And what a group of us are trying to identify are what we call known unknowns. Do you remember what was the guy? Rumsfeld, yeah, was talking about the known knowns and the unknown knowns. Yeah. So in this kind of research, there are quite a lot of known unknowns. And for example, if we want to study 3 or 5 Reiki practitioners, we have no way of knowing if they're at the same level of ability in general, or if one of them's having a bad day. So if we get variable results, we don't know if it's because it's difficult for Reiki in general to treat this condition, or we don't know if some practitioners are having good results and some not because of who they are. So that's one problem. A second known unknown is what you alluded to with Tiller's work, is that the energy in the room. You know, I talked to a guy who does pranic healing, and he said the first time he tried to do research, he brought the healers in and they said, "We can't work in here." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "This lab is dirty." And they don't know what that means. So he simply said to them, "Can you clean it?" And they cleaned the room, and then they were able to do that. So if the same, quote, the same study is being done, which we love to do, at 3 different places, so that if you do, so you don't have to do it sequentially. We're going to do it 3 times in different labs, and if we get the same results, well, terrific. But that's another big. How do we know the room energy is the same in those 3 places?
And the person conducting the experiments, belief systems and energy fields, mental energy fields, emotional energy fields, with all that kind of stuff.
It's really a bear to do this kind of research. Yep.
Yeah. I have a suggestion, actually. Have you ever considered to bring somebody in who's clairvoyant? I mean, who can see the subtle energy levels, in the auric field and then in the environment. I mean, to get the help from that perspective, because otherwise you are always having to assume things, and as you say, the known unknown issue will continue to bother you.
People are coming up with all kinds of ways to try to do this research. For example, some of you may be aware there was a big flurry of research maybe 10, 15 years ago in distant healing, where many different kinds of healers were simply given photographs of AIDS patients, and they were told to treat them. Well, so then somebody decided, how would it be if we had another group of healers who were giving booster energy to the ones who were really doing the study? No? Unknown, because the part of the problem with distant healing is you're actually treating people who are really ill, who have cardiac conditions, and so you don't know if their church groups are also doing the healing, or if their grandmother is a gifted healer and the grandmother's doing outside of your study. So it's really difficult to control that kind of distant healing. So this whole area of research is bedeviled by different kinds of problems, which I will bet have their counterparts in simple drug studies. But the drug studies are such like sledgehammer studies compared to the subtleties that we're trying to understand, with a change in the tuning fork sound or with a swinging of a pendulum. They're much more subtle energies. It's much more difficult to be in control, which we have to be to do research.
Yeah. So you had a question?
So a lot of what we're talking about here tonight is one group with an individual, or one individual with another individual, being able to heal through intuition and intention. Why do we need another person to do that for us? Is there any research on us being able to do that for ourselves without needing anyone else doing it for us?
Well, there's certainly studies on Qigong. There's certainly studies, many really good studies, for example, on Tai Chi, where they have figured out basic kind of, so you don't have to spend 3 years learning the Tai Chi before, there's a kind of standardized form of Tai Chi that is taught to Tai Chi teachers specifically for the research. And they know then they could do it at 6 different settings and it's going to be the same. So that kind of research where people are working on themselves is being done, and I think the best example of that is Tai Chi. A colleague of mine, Peter Wayne, is at some of you may have heard of the Osher centers. There's one at UC San Francisco, and one at Harvard, and one at Case Western Reserve, and a 4th one somewhere in the South. But this Osher family, you asked about how do we get funding. These few families are really been amazing in terms of funding this kind of research. The Samueli family is another one, although their Samueli Institute, after many years, has been put to bed. And that was a major blow to the few areas of funding for this research. Lost my train of thought, sorry.
Self-healing. Tom,
Self-healing, yes.
No?
Some self-healing, yep.
Let's see. Oh, Peter, did you have a question?
Well, I really was interested in your comment about the tuning fork research that you were doing. And we have our practice as working with angels through clairvoyant interactions and guidance. And when we would see interference, you could call it, energies or entity energies that are in the field around a person, we found it very interesting to take the tuning fork. We would have those tuning forks with the little weights on them, and we didn't have a hockey puck, but then we would take the tuning fork into the field, or also a bell, like as in a rod of metal, like aluminum, and you would
Zen
ring,
bar.
I think they called it a Zen bar or something like that, and you'd take it into the zone where the interference energy was, and it would literally go absolutely silent. You would go and it's one of the best demonstrations of the fact that what we might call entity or interference energy is existing, is objective, is in space, and can be removed, and then it's very objective, and it's not subtle. Not subtle at all.
Yes.
It's one of the most fascinating demonstrations. And then so I'm very interested that this lady, and I'm encouraged to hear this research.
Yeah, she has, I've read quite a few books And I would put hers really, this is why I was willing to work with her. It's called Tuning the Human Biofield is her book. And again, the first half of the book is a wonderful overview of energy healing historically.
Right.
And then the second half of the book is her experience with.
So just the one comment I'd like to make about that I think is inspiring is that interference energies consume the vitality of the field, which you can demonstrate by the sound being absorbed. They seem to take the energy into themselves, so there isn't the energy to propagate through the airways, that vibration. And I think it's very telling, because what we find is the fascial grid of the body, I think, works around, you were mentioning how they start to look at light and how the light transmits, and I've seen studies where they actually see how the light is crossing through the helix of the fascial molecule, and that it's actually affected and transmits, also conveys light. And it's affected by light in the way that the helix is actually structured. So what we see is when there's interference, there are these strange auditory effects, but very measurable body effects. So when we did a demonstration here, we showed entity presence, which is in a sense a blotter of energy, and body tightness, and entity release, and body looseness. And it's a fascinating correlation. So, yeah, and this is demonstrable. It's very demonstrable. It's consistent.
Yeah.
And so you have two crossing paths. You have body measurements to show energy is being absorbed away from the body, thereby affecting the fascia. And you have measurements of the absorption of sound. So you have an interesting scientific avenue there.
Definitely, except I'm a little concerned when you say thereby affecting the fascia, as if that's a given. I mean, how do we... I would love to believe that.
I could show you that countless times over and over and over. I've been doing it for
just by the tenseness or the
range of motion.
Range of motion. Fine.
And
Great.
Physical therapist for 38 years. So
terrific.
Paid to measure that professionally.
Yep.
And absolutely consistent effect. Absolutely. In every case, actually, that we have looked at, there's an absolute correlation, very clear correlation between where energy is blocked in you could say by a blotter or a blockage that obstructs flow, and a tightness in the body.
Or by the trauma in the field. I love the tree ring idea that you gave.
Yes. Anytime the energy flow is blocked through either a confused field or a blotted field or a deficient field, the effect on the body is absolutely predictable, and through clairvoyant observation, identified without anybody informing you where the blockage is. You can actually identify it in advance and demonstrate. It's a fascinating demonstration. But I'd like to connect with you whenever you have the time around this, because I think it blows open the field of an objective effect of an energy blockage and an energy clearing. And I've been excited about it across my career as an clairvoyant angelic, because the guidance you spoke of, and I so respect what you're saying, Jenny, because you have to release at a certain point a strictly rigorous I know, I understand, or it is not so. I agree with you. There is a time to be also interfacing. I am open, I am informed, I test, I observe, I gain confidence in my power of observation and in my intuitive sense through the interface of the physical and the invisible. And that's where I've come to greatly respect the effect of influences in consciousness on energy flow. And it's so clear that it ultimately comes back to a field of mind. and that there are many sources of information, such as you referred to. And it would be arrogant to think in our limited human perception with our bias that we can necessarily exclude all this rich information that shows a higher mind. Anyway.
Well, just two very quick things. One is, I think all of the research with fascia is just almost the most exciting area that is going to expand the biomedical model. But they have to really be willing to go with what the research is. First of all, the fascia is ideally situated to be that interface between the external information and the internal.
Right into the DNA.
Right into the DNA. And the second is that the fact that it's a whole body system. You don't evolve a whole body system and just have it sit there to readjust. It's going to be an information carrying system. It has to be.
It is.
And once we figure out how to tap into that, it's going to be a whole nother level of understanding of physiology. The other thing is, I would love to have a medical anthropologist or two with me, and I can't imagine they haven't done that, to talk to you about the angels and to also talk about the shamanic spirit guides and see how do we see if they are giving us similar kinds of information. Do they act in similar ways? Do you access them in similar ways? Just as what's our shamanic healer's name? I'm just blocking on the main shamanic guy.
Michael Harner?
Yeah, Michael Harner. So Michael Harner went, obviously we know, around the world studying all different cultures and was amazed to find the similarities in shamanic healing, the spirit animals, the spirit guides, the soul retrieval, in all of these cultures that had no clear overlap. So how do we extend that kind of research to shamanic guides and other kinds of entities?
Right, and I think the common ground is E. It's we connect with those guides, whatever we name them, through intention.
Yeah.
And then it fluoresces into, it opens, it's there. So when you intend to connect, it's there, period. And even in a dirty lab.
Right. Oh, I hear you.
I'm just very happy that you bring the issue of angelic and energy of guides into the discussion, because we know now factually that healers, if they just use their own storage of energy for healing, that they can actually get sick eventually.
Yeah. I was in a Chinese lab with a squid magnetometer and everything, and they say, and I went into a hospital and I treated frozen shoulders, which are fascial contracture conditions, and they looked at it and they said, okay, bam, you can do this. Okay, fine. You can go outside this Faraday box. You can identify field effects beyond this Faraday box, and you can influence them through what you're doing with your intention and your consciousness healing. We see that. Same thing we've observed with our own Qigong healers. I went to China to study acupuncture, and they I think I forgot my point. I'm sorry. That's it. They said to me, "You'll be dead in 5 years."
Oh,
exactly. If you continue doing
what you're doing through your intention. And I didn't know about angels at that time. It was 1989 or 1990. I came home, and in 3 years I was in the hospital for 3 weeks because my field was being confused through my ability to interact with other people's fields, merge with them, and influence them. That was an amazing ability, but an unhealthy ability.
Because it's also a drain on you.
Right. And what happened was, I will keep this very short, but my immune system reacted to the energy merge. And I got what was known as an autoimmune disease, which I had pemphigus, and my throat and my mouth were massively inflamed with terrible sores, and I got very, very sick. I think close to death, in the sense of I was collapsing. So I go to work, I collapse. I stay away from it, I start to heal. Well, then, by the grace of God, I found this angelic interface. The information comes to me, not through me absorbing into you, you absorbing into me, whatever, and no ill effect. And through the intermediate informational source, I had no loss that you're referring to. And the disease went away, and the interface maintains this effect. And we just have joy, is what we experience, just pure joy. We never feel tired, and the other person doesn't feel, the energy isn't transferring that way through the intermediary. So I totally agree with you, and they told me that, and they were right. I got sick.
Good point, very important point.
So I think we have time for one more question, one more quick question. Anybody have one more quick question that they're burning to ask? Okay.
Right there's one.
I have a daughter who recently encountered massive chemical sensitivity and electromagnetic sensitivity, and was almost died when she was really good. And she found an approach using neural plasticity training, and there's a whole regimen that leads to. My question is, have you heard of this or run across this? And it seems to be an amazing interface possibility to the kind of work you're doing.
I don't know specifically what that is. Certainly, neuroplasticity is a term that has a very specific meaning within neurology. People are finding that, when I first was going to graduate school, the dogma was you're born with this set of neurons, and a certain percent are going to die every year, and it's all downhill. And now, there's just such really good evidence that plasticity makes so much sense. It's too bad they call it plasticity, because we think of plastics as a kind of negative connotation, but it means, if this isn't working, then this comes, and a different pathway is created to do the same thing, to take over where that, and it makes so much sense in terms of survival and neural ability to do that. But there are so many idiosyncratic techniques that use these terms to give it a patina of value, and sometimes the value is there, and sometimes it's not there, and like so many other things, it's not the technique, it's the person doing it, that's so important. And everybody says, I tried acupuncture and it didn't work. Like, who gave you the acupuncture? Well, my MD, gave me acupuncture. And, there are some MDs that are very gifted, and there are some MDs who went to China and learned, many years of study of acupuncture, and there's some MDs who have done this short course. And so, and even there, so even with well-trained acupuncturists, so those are two problems, I would say. One is that there's such a plethora of techniques, and many of them have similar names, and many of them are because of personality problems, as we all know, and they branched off from this, and they, it's not this kind of therapeutic touch, it's that kind of therapeutic touch, and it's just part of the nature, the nature of the beast, and it's with acupuncture, when you have something that's been around for thousands of years, it just makes sense that they're all different. It was family secrets, for so long. That's what it was, and the Maoists came and they said, we can't afford. The Maoists wanted to bring in Western biomedicine to China, and they realized there was no way they could do it, no way they could afford it, and they did a total about-face and went on huge billboards that said, Chinese medicine is a great treasure house, is how it was translated, but their kind of Chinese medicine, which was, for instance, they took the Shen out of the medicine, which is the spirit. That was not going to be accepted to the West, so Chinese medicine had to be Shen-free. And so many people now are trying to put that back into the medicine, and they didn't want. So anyway, that's not really answering the question, but it's saying.
I think you say it's good. Yeah,
maybe it may be it may be a wonderful technique, and the proof of the pudding is that she's found something that worked. And we don't know, and we don't really care if her body wasn't ready, if all those other things that didn't work really primed her, and then the next thing worked, or the next thing was the thing that really turned it around. We're not going to know, but the bottom line is she's better.
Yeah. May I just add one point to what you were just saying, is that even if you have the best kind of healer in the world, or the best MD and so forth, if the patient or the one that is treated is not receptive, and has doubts and a whole, system of negative thinking about it, it's very difficult for that person to get healed. So there is this reciprocal kind of interrelationship between healer and patient, or the one who's the receiving part.
I mean, it matters if you believe in Western medicine. It helps too, so I don't want to throw out belief, but when they say it's just belief, that's we can't have that either.
So we have one last comment here.
Okay.
Well, it's just a funny thing to add to her comment. So when I'm doing something, my parents are not well versed in energy healing. They're conservative Baptists, but when I'm doing something with them to help, like I just was doing something for my dad last night, moving a rib that was out of place, whatever. And I'll always say, so it'll move, and it'll be done, and I go often do my thing, and then he's up out of his chair and he's moving, and everything seems fine. I said, so how are you feeling? And he said, well, it's pretty good. And I said, well, so is it gone? He says, no, I think, it'll probably come back. He'll make some comment. So I'll say, well, would it be okay if it was gone? He says, well, that's a silly question. Well, but would it be okay? Well, and of course he's hard, and my mom will go, well, Armin, just say yes. and so I'll ask, would it be okay if it was gone? He said, well, oh yes, of course it would. And would it be okay if it stayed gone? Well, yeah. Well, now he's fine. But if I didn't do that, it does come back. So I play that little game, and they know I'm going to ask that question, and it works.
That's great. Okay, so thank you very much, Richard. That was Thank you, and thanks for all your questions. And so we're going to do our unstringing the beads, and so we're going to pass the heart around and ask you to just say your name, and then anything you'd like to say for the evening.